Hosea chapter number 3 tonight. We have this week, we've got next week, and then the following week is the 21st. And I'd like that to be our praise and thanksgiving night, because it was scheduled for the end of the month, but we won't be meeting together since that's just right after Christmas time. So we're going to move that back by 1 week. So on the 21st, it'll be praise and thanksgiving night. I might spring something on you guys. I tell you, I'd like for a few of you guys to give just a brief 5-minute message on praise and thanksgiving. Okay, that's what we're going to do. I really would like to hear somebody else do something with that. I might give you guys a little bit of talk time on praise and thanksgiving if now no one's going to show up on the 21st for sure. Give it some thought, please, and let me talk to you again further about that. You hear me talk all the time. I hate hearing myself talk. Yeah, okay. Well, I'll give you another $1 later, Brother Warren. Thank you for that. All right, Hosea 3. Then said the Lord unto me, Go yet, love a woman beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress according to the love of the Lord toward the children of Israel, who look to other gods and love flagons of wine. So I bought her to me for 15 pieces of silver, and for an homer of barley, and an half homer of barley. And I said unto her, Thou shalt abide for me many days, thou shalt not play the harlot, and thou shalt not be for another man, so will I also be for thee. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, and without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, and without an ephod, and without teraphim. Afterward shall the children of Israel return, and seek the Lord their God, and David their king, and shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. We looked at last week just at verse 1. That's what we focused our attention on there. And that was the command that was given. And so I want to pick it up in verse 2 at continued obedience. Continued obedience, verse number 2, so I bought her. Now, that's an interesting phrase there, that he bought her. And again, I think I might have pointed this out last week, but Hosea is serving as a double illustration here. Firstly, he's obeying as one who obeys God even in difficult matters. Not easy for him to go and take his wife back after all that she had put herself through and taken the family through. So he's an illustration of that. That's a very practical thing for us, that in difficult matters we can still obey God. And if Hosea can do it, we surely can. The second thing that he illustrates, which is on the bigger picture here, is that he's one who exercises overcoming love. And if you remember again with Gomer and all that she's done, when God says to him, Go yet, love a woman. And again, I still believe that's Gomer. No matter how many times I look over it, it's what I come back to. Go yet, love a woman. And that verse 2, so I bought her to me. And he's buying her because he has to buy her to express his love for her. And so those are the two illustrations, that he's given to us. One that overcomes difficult times and obeys God, and one who shows us the overcoming love that we're seeing in God toward Israel. All right. Now I want you to look at tonight this fact that the obedience of Hosea cost him something. So we looked at the command and now the continued obedience. His obedience cost him something. Somehow some people get in their mind that obedience is free, or that obedience is going to pay us. Whew! That somehow obedience has no cost to it. It's always going to reward us. And there is the reward. There's a reward of blessing. There's a reward of knowing that you've pleased the Lord. And all those things are true. There is that reward. But sometimes your obedience is just going to cost you something, like it did Hosea. And so we look at this. First of all, he says in verse 2, I bought her to me for 15 pieces of silver. So let's look at this thing. Her price is half the value of a slave. Keep your finger here and go to Exodus chapter number 21. Exodus chapter number 21. Now, during the giving of the law, God gave the money value of people for their souls, and that wasn't to say that they were worth little, that you could buy a man's soul, but rather that when there was going to be a redemption made, that's how you were to determine the value of those people, men servants, maid servants, slaves, and otherwise. And so God, He puts these values on people, and each one is different. He says here in verse number 32, if the ox shall push a manservant or a maidservant, he shall give unto their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. So the value that we see here on the servant, the maidservant, was 30 pieces, and that's the same idea, pieces or shekels of silver. That's the value of this woman. All right, so go back to chapter 3 in Hosea. We see that the obedience that God has commanded him to carry out is one that's going to cost him money. He's going to have to pay up for somebody that should already belong to him. And he coughs it up. This is his love. And then he says in the second part of that verse, and for an homer of barley and a half homer of barley. Can't believe how the commentaries go on and on about how this is the only time in the Bible that a half homer is ever mentioned. Okay. You can bank on that, can't you? Take that home with you tonight and grow on that spiritually. Anyway, they did. But I do want to talk to you about barley. Barley was the food that was generally saved for animals. There were times that barley would be given to people, but it was only when they were destitute, poor, when there was war and famine, then barley was what you turned to, but it was the worst of the grains that you could get. So when they traded in barley, they were always trading, I don't want to say always, they were generally trading for the purpose of their animals, something to give fodder for their animals. The homer and the half homer of barley is the largest Jewish dry measurement that there is. So it wasn't just a small amount. It wasn't a cup full and it wasn't a handful. You understand, it was a big basket full of barley. And it was generally, the way the thing was weighed out initially was the amount that could be carried by a mule. So it's quite a bit. But that shows you just really how valueless the barley is. So he's taken this barley, this homer of barley and half homer of barley, and he's added that to his payment of 15 pieces of silver. And what it indicates here is that the condition of Gomer is such that she doesn't illustrate much value. Now that much barley, they reckon, and I guess I stammer a little bit because I have to take the word of people who seem to know better. They reckon that much barley would be worth about 15 pieces of silver, which would then total up that she was worth the price of the maidservant in Exodus chapter 21, except he didn't have to pay that. He paid the silver and bargained with barley on the second part of that. And so again, there's this indication that she is... her condition is very poor. It's almost animalistic. And if the person who was in possession of her when he bought her saw the value in her, then he would have demanded the 30 pieces of silver or more. It's the fact that he didn't see value in her that he was willing to take half of it in silver and half of it that he would just end up giving to his animals anyway. Are you with me? Okay. So when you combine the silver and the barley, we learn this, that Gomer is purchased again for the equivalent price of a slave, and that the man that owned her didn't value her very highly. When we look at her life, what we have to understand is that she had devalued herself through the associations that she had had in life. She prostituted herself. And of course, every time she did that, the value that she had in the eyes of people would go down. She had chosen her path. She had decided that she would love those who would devalue her rather than the one who would give her value in the Lord. And that's really a great lesson again for us to take away here, is Gomer's choice of lovers left her more like an animal than like a person. And her lifestyle had completely broken her down. And even though Hosea was willing to go pay this, the normal person will look at her as worthless. Obviously, it's a picture of Israel, and we have to carry that through this whole passage because that is the point of the illustration. But again, I started this off by saying that Hosea's obedience cost him. And in the end, the woman who was meant to be a faithful wife to him, whom he had already cared for, had brought him humiliation, embarrassment, and all of those things that go with that type of relationship. But on top of it, in order to please the Lord, he had to go buy her again. So even though we see that she's valueless in the eyes of men, or very little value, Hosea was happy to go and obey God and buy her, and it cost him. Brother, we need to think about sometimes that it does cost us to obey God, and sometimes we may look at it and say, on a human level, this doesn't seem to make sense. There's no value in it. I shouldn't have to do this. But God says, this is how I want you to exercise overcoming love. You and I would look at her and say she was worthless. Hosea looked at her and said, she's still valuable to me. That's a lot of love. Israel also lost her value. Among the nations, when she got involved in idolatry, she had ruined herself, and in her prostitution through idolatry had devalued herself to where she had gone from the greatest of nations to the least of nations. And she was on the verge here of being destroyed and taken over by the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians. And they would not see any value in the nation of Israel whatsoever. It was just another conquered nation. But to God, she had value. And that's how we need to see her today, because this transaction is yet to take place. And so when we read through that, it said, in verse number 2 again, I bought her to me for 15 pieces of silver and for an homer of barley and an half homer of barley. Notice that verse 3 is a carry on from that thought. And so he says, as he's buying her, I said unto her, thou shalt abide for me many days. And so the third thing I want us to see in this chapter is a covenant of faithfulness. And there's conditions on Hosea's purchase of Gomer. She's to stay faithful. That is, to abide for many days. And he says, as he describes that, thou shalt not play the harlot, and thou shalt not be for another man. And so his condition on buying her is reasonable, to say no more harlotry and keep yourself for me alone. In return, he says at the end of verse 3, so will I also be for thee. In other words, I'm going to be faithful. Now the conditions that he had laid down when he first married the woman had never changed for him. When we look back at chapter 2, you remember that there's the illustration there where he says, you go plead with your mother because she's not my wife. And that's true. There was a separation. There's a divorce. But his love hadn't changed. And it's a difficult thing maybe to understand entirely. And I'm not sure that I do. I believe it, but I'm not sure I understand it. That even though he was willing to separate, willing to divorce, and to just be rid of the whole situation, that if you could somehow separate the emotion of the betrayal away from his true heart, he would say, I love her. So he hasn't changed a thing when he asks her to be faithful. He says, I'll be faithful to you. I'm not seeking revenge in this matter. I'm not going to go out and have my own relationships now to make you pay the price for what you've put me through. Now that happens in many instances, that people do that sort of thing, and it's just as wicked when the other person does it. But this marriage is going to be a covenant of faithfulness between a man and his wife. They stood at the altar, they made the vows, and now it's time to keep it. And this is what he's approaching her with. Now there appears to be here a period of time that I'm going to call a proving time, when he said, "Thou shalt abide for me many days." Again, there's so many people that have so many different opinions on it, and honestly, all I'm trying to do is just interpret it with Scripture and understanding it through the Scriptures. And so that's how I give it to you tonight. So there's this proving time, this proving period, and Gomer is going to have to illustrate her commitment to the relationship with Hosea and to be worthy of the restored relationship. I'm buying you back. I married you the first time, and by the way, he would have had to have given a dowry to get to marry her in the beginning in chapter 1. So he's essentially paid for her twice. Okay. But now he's saying, look, I'm buying you back from your servanthood, from your slavehood. And in return from that, what I want right now is that you're my purchased possession. And you're my wife too, but there's going to be a proving time first. And I want you to remain, or to abide, he says, many days. Abide for me many days. During that time, she's not going to have the normal relationship that a woman would expect in marriage. She's not going to have that part of what God would normally give. She's going to abide desolate for a time, which we read in chapter 2. There's going to be a separation period. And again, this isn't because Hosea doesn't love her. He does. But he's guarding himself against her tendency to fornicate. So she won't have the normal blessings of marriage in the relationship, but Hosea is by no means just casting her out and saying, take care of yourself. He's going to look after her as well. Now you say, where do you come up with all that? By the interpretation of it, which is given to us in verses 4 and 5. So let's read those two verses now with the thoughts that I've given you to help us now establish the case. For, and that word means something to us, for the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, and without an ephod, and without teraphim. Afterward shall the children of Israel return. So you see that God is saying this to Israel too. We're allowing them to interpret one another. We're allowing them to say, look, we can understand Israel and God through Homer. Wow, where is it going to end? Through Gomer and Hosea, and we can understand Gomer and Hosea. Shut up, you kids, I'll get you later. Gomer and Hosea through the relationship of God and Israel. It's just to be a mirror so we can look at it back and forth. Now, this is why I give you that interpretation, that there's going to be a time where she is his purchased possession without the relationship, but the relationship is promised to come when she proves her faithfulness and commitment to it. Okay. Now before we move on to verse 4 and 5, I want to come back to verse 3 and say this. I'd like for you to maybe make note here and study in the book of Leviticus that there is often a cleansing period for someone who had made themselves unclean or had become unclean. If there was a leper, then they would be separated from the company of Israel for a period of time. And that period sometimes would vary from days to the rest of their life, depending on how the leprosy took its hold in their body. Miriam, for instance, was made a leper because of her whinging and complaining, conspiring against Moses along with Aaron. And so she, apparently the chief spokeswoman in that case, copped it. And God said, even when Moses begged for her, he said, look, if her dad had even spat in her face, she'd be separated from the company for a time. And so she was separated, I believe it's for a week, and this was her uncleanness. There's laws for all sorts of things through the book of Leviticus about uncleanness. And even though there's nothing specifically said about the situation that we find in Hosea, that's why I say I want you to study it, because I think that what you have here is an image of that, or a shadow of it, that this time where she abides many days for Hosea is not only a proving time, but it's also a cleansing or a purifying time. Proving and purifying. She would have to cleanse herself from her relationships. That's the best way I know how to say that. All right, verse 4 and 5. Let me see how many Oh, good heavens above. I don't know. No, let's not do that. Let's not race through it. Let's just stop there. Boy, I hate that. I really wanted to get through it. Okay, you better get to your video because I'm stopping. Alrighty. Father, would you dismiss us with your blessing tonight? I really didn't get to travel as far as I wanted to, but I don't see the need in pressing forward and dragging things out tonight. Lord, I trust you're okay with that. Still plenty to learn from tonight, God, of this overcoming love, and we recognize that Hosea had something special, unique from the Lord, and that's what you told him, that he was going to have to love that woman according to the love of God for Israel. And we see it played out in his life. And Lord, I just ask that you'd help us to keep that in mind as we have to love people that are unlovely sometimes. And we have to stretch ourselves, and it's going to cost us some things at times. And it may not be just in the eyes of man, but it is for you. It's just in your eyes when you guide us to do those things. And that's the matter at hand, Lord, is that we have to know that we're doing it by your will, by your direction. So I pray that you help us to learn from Hosea tonight and learn from Israel. And Father, on a personal level, would you help us to learn to just stay close and not put you in a position where we have to go through these punishments and times of chastisements and cleansing and purifying and proving. Now, God, I pray that you dismiss your church with your blessing tonight, and I do thank you for them. And I pray for a good week in Jesus' name. Amen.